We are here to speak about the D&H Canal. This is Dave from Schoharie Crossing, and we have joining us this evening Bill Merchant, who is the curator, historian, and deputy director for collections at the D&H Canal Museum. He also serves as the president of the Delaware and Hudson Transportation Heritage Council. Bill is the vice president of the Ulster County Historical Society. It is on the board of the Century House Historical Society. And as far as I'm aware, at least, he is the only speaker that we have scheduled this year that also holds a U.S. patent. So please welcome Bill Merchant speaking on the D&H Canal.
I want to thank you so much, David, for that wonderful intro and for having me. And I want to thank Schoharie Crossing. You know, I'm a Schenectady boy myself, and I've never been. So the next time I'm up, I'll make a point of coming by. I'm sure it's great. Anything having to do with canals will always get me. I would like to take a second to thank Deborah Conway, who was nice enough to get me a room here. The internet where I was going to do this from was acting up today, but I really wanted. Then Deborah got me in touch with Johnny and Roswell at the Stick It In here in beautiful Berryville, New York, right along the D&H Canal. In fact, Lock 69 used to be right next to the Stick It In. You can't make this stuff up, people. Thank you so much, Johnny and Roswell, for giving me this room to work out of. And so far, I don't think the technical difficulties were on this end. And I want to welcome you all to the D&H Canal 19th Century Engine of Prosperity Erie Canal Edition. You know, a lot of people think that the D&H Canal was actually was an offshoot of the Erie, and that's not really quite accurate. But there's an awful lot of spots where it kind of comes together. And so I thought this was a wonderful opportunity to talk about where the Erie informed the D&H in this era of Canal Fever in America in the first half, certainly, of the 19th century. And as David said, if you have questions, I feel free to ask them. Hopefully he can interrupt me when they come along, and I'll be happy to answer them. But I always like context. Our story starts with the War of 1812. You know, by 1812, America had been heavily settled. We've been 200 years the people settled, the Dutch starting in 1619. Everything east of the Appalachian Mountains was pretty well denuded of trees. We really needed coal. We were buying our coal from the British. Do you know it was cheaper to ship coal across the Atlantic Ocean than to ship it by land? So we had coal down in Virginia. We didn't have the transportation infrastructure to get it anywhere. And so that's where we begin. And the War of 1812, during that war, there was a pair of dry goods merchants by the name of Morris and William Wrtz. There were actually four Wrtz brothers. There's John on our right there. John was really important. John was a member of the Pennsylvania legislature. Eventually, he also was on the national legislative for at least one term. You know, when you get the idea to have a canal in two states, it really helps to have a brother that's in the legislative, right? So the Wrtz brothers had a dry goods store in Philadelphia, and they got a contract to supply uniforms to the U.S. government for the War of 1812. The U.S. government at the time was more land rich and cash poor. Some things sort of never change, I guess. And as a consequence, they actually paid the brothers in coal-bearing lands in the Wyoming and Lackawanna valleys in the northeastern section of Pennsylvania, where they had anthracite coal. Not the bituminous that we were getting from the British, but actually cleaner burning anthracite. But that also had some problems that related to it, anthracite. So the Erie Canal trained America's civil engineers. We didn't have schools of civil engineering. The very first civil engineering degree given by a U.S. University is Union College in 1843 or 44. At that point, the canal era is really kicking. We've got this wonderful Asher B. Durand etching of DeWitt Clinton. He's a special man because he's really the father of canals in New York State. It was Clinton's ditch, wasn't it, the Erie Canal? Clinton's Folly. The joke was on them. As you probably all know, the Erie Canal made money the very first year. Its toll income paid the debt service. The main line of the Erie Canal, to my knowledge, never lost money. It was nothing but a good investment for the state of New York. And most canals were financed by states in early American history. But here we've got a couple of gentlemen, Benjamin Wright, Judge Wright, was the chief engineer of the Erie Canal, certainly the eastern section, but most books, David, maybe you know better, but certainly one of the major engineers for the Erie. And these two other gentlemen, James McEntee on our right there, and John Jervis on our left, both of them young men who got jobs working under Benjamin Wright and basically learned canal engineering while working on the Erie. In fact, John Jervis in his reminiscence just said, he just shut up and listened. There's a lesson for all of us, hey, folks. Actually, he studied too. He's a fascinating man and was lauded later in life by the then American Society of Civil Engineers. And these two gentlemen become important to my story that I'm telling to all you folks today. So the brothers, they get a little bit of coal. The way they would move items was on, we had Native American trails and we had muddy dirt roads. In fact, it was better to ship in the winter because then at least it was frozen. There really wasn't any sort of effective transportation infrastructure, and canals really filled that need in American history. In England, you had the Roman roads. Of course, they had canals in Europe prior to this. But in America, this is a wonderful, just in that 75 years from, well, I'm going to say longer because the Erie starts in 1818. But in that early part of the 19th century, as I say, it was the era of Canal Fever. So the brothers get a little bit of their coal to Philadelphia, but, they can't compete. The Schuylkill Valley and the Lehigh Valley coal was closer. Transportation costs were lower, and so they really couldn't compete. And in fact, they had other problems too. They tried rafting down the Lackawaxen River, where their mines were. We're in a town called Carbondale. Let's see if we can find it on this wonderful map here. Rick's is yeah, it's not even Carbondale yet on this map. But it gets dubbed Carbondale in 23 or 24. So they ran some of their coal to market down the Lackawaxen River here. It actually foundered within a mile or two. And don't you know, they were actually able to sell to somebody, but there weren't a lot of people there to sell to, and that wasn't going to do. So they quickly realized that they needed both a new market and a better way to move their product. So they hired chief engineer Benjamin Wright, Judge Wright, and had him survey. They decided New York City was the place. So in 1812, when this story begins, Philadelphia is the largest city in America. By 1820, New York City is now larger than Philadelphia. The die is cast, you can say, by topography and geography. New York City was destined to become what it did become. But D&H coal really did help it. So to get this ball rolling, they hired Benjamin Wright, who was already so sought after that the survey was actually done under his direction by a John Mills and John Sullivan. And this is the route that they laid out. It's a little hard to see. I love this map, though. This map was produced in 1824, as you can see there on the bottom. And there's nothing, there's no canal in any of Pennsylvania. That's because they did not decide on anything in Pennsylvania until the final year of construction, 1828. But you'll see the canal route here. Even I have to move. There it is, the canal route all the way here, up in here. And then they've got the Kingston route. That's not the route they adopted. But we'll get to that in a second as well. But a wonderful map I found in an online auction now in the collection of the D&H Canal Historical Society will be on display in our new museum that we're working on that will be opening at the end of the season next year. So the other thing that Judge Wright told them is that this canal is going to cost you $1.2 million. Hey, that's real money. In fact, that's some $30 million in spending in today. So the equivalent would basically, can you imagine? So where are you going to get $30 million? You need investors. So coffee houses in early American and European history in the 17th and 18th centuries were centers of finance. The Tontine Coffee House, very famous, was on Wall Street. And the Tontine was a place where men who had money to invest would go and meet with people who had investment schemes. There wasn't a real stock market. The stock market starts in America in the latter part of the 18th century, but it's not formalized. In fact, the New York Stock Exchange met in the boardroom of the Tontine Coffee House for the very first time, and I think it was 1823. But so the brothers knew that they needed investors. They almost quickly become taken over by New York City folks. A whole bunch of New York City money comes in. and they opened their stock books on a cold January day in 1825, January 7th. Now, they're selling anthracite coal, and not everybody thought you could burn that stuff. Stone coal. There's stories of this black coal getting to market and people out of frustration just using it to line the streets. Probably look pretty, nice, shiny black rocks, right? Um, blacksmiths in Philadelphia knew about it before the Revolutionary War, and they loved the stuff. It burned longer and hotter, but you had to learn how to burn it mainly. And in fact, eventually the D&H has special grates made to teach people how to use it. The trick was you needed a really hot hardwood fire, uh, and you needed more oxygen. So the grates are very tall against, so you could get the airflow around it. But the brothers knew that, and this newly formed D&H company, how did they sell that stock? They started a fire on a cold January day, and the lore has it that they were opening windows and shedding garments because it burned so well. And they sell out their entire stock offering, over $1.2 million by mid-afternoon. They also were selling at Kingston and Goshen, so they were selling along the route of the canal. But this was a New York City enterprise. New York City was going to be the main beneficiary, and throughout its history, it's very New York centric. The D&H really helped. I mean, certainly the Erie did as well. I don't want to, but the D&H really did help make New York City the center that it became. So they got some, they say 10% down. One book I was looking at recently said 75,000. That was enough money to get you started. And here is the route that this was the route that Sullivan and Mills under Wright postulated. And this is the route that they built. They followed the Lackawaxen River. You would always follow river valleys because you needed a source of water, excuse me. Indeed, anytime you had water up higher than the canal, you figured out a way to get it into the canal. So you would follow a river valley. The other thing is, if you think about it, in a river valley, you could go the longest amount, you could keep it at a level for the longest without needing locks. Locks are devices that enable you to move things above changes in elevation. Typically, locks in the D&H Canal had 10 foot of lift. Some had more later. But basically, you wanted to have as few locks as possible. So the Erie Canal had some 385 locks across 365 miles. Well, I mentioned the Appalachians being a real barrier. America really, when this story begins, was everything east of the Appalachians. Everything west of it, Davy Crockett, Daniel Boone, what did they do? They just went over that mountain. But the Erie Canal actually exploited the Mohawk River Valley, which is where nature cut you a break. So here, this very long canal only needed 85 locks. The D&H Canal needed 110 locks to begin with. Eventually, after its final enlargement, it's down to 108, but I'm getting ahead of my story now. So here they built it along the Lackawaxen River to the confluence of the Lackawaxen and the Delaware. And early on, they had a rope ferry, and the single animal went on. The boats were 75 foot long, 9 foot wide, and carried about 30 tons of coal. And a single animal, they say horses, but it was horses and mules, probably largely mules. They then followed the Delaware River all along to what was known at the time as Carpenter's Point, but was named Port Jervis after our man, John Jervis. You'll see a lot of the towns here. Honesdale was named for Phillips Hone, the very first president of the D&H and famous diarist. Wurtzboro for the Wrtz Brothers, and on and on. So what they were buying was a 108-mile long canal that was 32 foot wide at the top, 20 foot at the bottom, what we call the prism, and it was 4 foot deep. As I say, they had 110 locks, 22 aqueducts, and over 200 bridges.
Hey,
who do you think? Go ahead.
Can I just ask a real quick question? If it started along the Lackawaxen River, why is it not the Lackawaxen and Hudson?
Right? I've always wondered that too. I actually didn't finish our story because once we got to the Delaware, I got a little sidetracked there. It follows stop that. It follows the Neversink River. Then somewhere in here, there's the Sandberg Creek, and about here it hits the Roundout. And here it gets to the Hudson River. There's still 80 miles for their intended market of New York City. And in fact, Newburgh, which is somewhere around here, when they heard a canal was coming through, they went to the company and said, hey, have it end here. Well, the Shawangum Mountains that are from here, all along this spot here, were too big a barrier. They don't get tunneled until 1870s when a railroad goes through. But they actually do send John Jervis to do a survey. I think, cynic that I am, they just wanted as much money. They needed to get that stock sold, you know. So I think they wanted to let everybody know. But to get to your question, Lackawanna and Hudson just doesn't have much of a ring to it. It's hard to say. Delaware and Hudson, on the other hand, they're referencing the two better known rivers. In the 17th century, the Hudson River was known as the North River, and the Delaware River was known as the South River. So those were the major waterways. And so my assumption would be, and it's funny because I've never, this is why I love having people give me questions. But the Delaware and Hudson, actually early on, sometimes I find newspaper accounts that calls it the Hudson and Delaware Canal. But when they formed that company in 1824, they dubbed it the Delaware and Hudson Canal. The company had a much longer name. The managers and president or officers of the D&H Canal. I don't know. I haven't memorized that. It's so long. You know. But there you have it. But, you know, that's an awful lot to dig, an awful lot to build. And in fact, I can tell you definitively, it was largely immigrants, people of color as well, but largely Irish immigrants. My friend John Conway here, Deborah's husband, Sullivan County historian, has said that it was Irish laborers and German stonemasons, and that would make some sense. There was a lot of stonework. We'll talk about cement and stonework a little later here in the talk. But it wound up being Irishmen, and I love this quote from Dickens. For who else would dig and delve and drudge and do domestic work and make canals and roads and execute great lines of internal improvement? You're Irish. Even then, there were jobs Americans didn't want. And this I always have to point out to people too. The Irish in the 19th century were vilified. They were Catholic. That was not cool. They were considered just a step above enslaved people of color. And you would see signs, Irish need not apply. But without the Irish, this canal could not have been dug. Without the Irish, this canal would not have operated. And I'll bet you, now I know the Erie, David, they say they didn't need Irishmen in the western edge early on because there was all sorts of people there needing work. But I do know that the Irish definitely in the many enlargements, the Erie underwent, I won't have the number, but the Erie underwent like 6 or 7 enlargements across 150 years. And certainly the enlargements were largely accomplished by the Irish. And of course, the Irish were the canalers. But again, I get ahead of my story. We're still digging it. So they do this in 2.5 years. They dig this entire thing through a largely wilderness. An amazing undertaking, considering all they had was picks, shovels, and black powder. We didn't have dynamite yet. And we don't have pictures of construction. In fact, all of the pictures that you're going to see are probably post-Civil War. Photography was prevalent starting in the 1840s. You had daguerreotypes, but most of the photographs we historical societies have probably are Civil War or 1860s and later. So I can't show you a picture of those early boats, but we'll see a few pictures of the later boats after the enlargement. But once again, John Jervis. So Benjamin Wright is chief engineer. He's out there, you know, he's doing what he can. Jervis was his first assistant engineer, but in June of 1827, Wright's got too many other things. That guy had to have gotten pretty rich digging canals, and it was all because of the Erie. John Jervis, he is named the chief engineer of the D&H in 1827. He only works through the construction of it, and then he moves on to railroads and the Croton Aqueduct, and then he's one of the people that thought of the railroad truck. Anybody know what that is? You know, if you got a 4-wheeled vehicle, and it's 40 foot long, the arc that it can turn would be described by the distance. His idea, and in his reminiscence, he also credits another gentleman that I can't remember his name offhand. But if you put 4 wheels in the front and 4 wheels in the back, what they call the truck, now a railroad car can navigate tighter turns. But I really love this, what you see there on the left. John Jervis had the idea of lining underneath aqueducts and culverts with wood. So you see right here, this timber. This was a picture I took a couple of years back at the Mountain Brook Aqueduct in Accord, New York, then known as Port Jackson, probably named for President Jackson, Andrew Jackson, because I can't find any famous local guy named Jackson, but this would have been just the year when that very first populist president, Andrew Jackson, is elected. So my surmise, and this isn't, I can't prove it, was that Port Jackson was named for Andrew Jackson. But getting back to this John Jervis innovation, he mentions in his reminiscences that this was an idea of his that he implemented on the Erie. I love that you can see this today at the Stony Kill Aqueduct in Accord as well, and also right here on the Mountain Brook Aqueduct in the bottom of the water, because it's not exposed to the air. This wood was put in 1850 or earlier, possibly in the original in 1826, 27, and it's still there. But think about it. By having parallel wood there and not sticks and stones and stuff, debris, especially in the spring, would wash under and not blow out your canal. So kind of a nifty idea of Mr. Jervis. And these are the kinds of bridges that they were building. This is fascinating too. These are what we call pony truss covered bridges. And I have to thank historian Ron Knapp, who's written 2 books on covered bridges, for pointing this out. And when he first said, Bill, that's a picture of a covered bridge, I said, no, it's not. It's not. There's no cover over the people. When they invented covered bridges, or when they started building them in America in the early 19th century, they realized that if you have a wooden truss bridge, it lasts about 15 years. But if you cover the trusses, it'll last 50 to 60 years. The D&H Canal had probably 150 covered bridges, largely unknown to the Society for the Preservation of the Covered Bridge. I now have 24 documented bridges that I'm about to, Ron and I will do a paper on it. We're going to present some of this and add to the database. But here's a wonderful pony truss covered bridge on the D&H Canal. I would imagine the Erie had these at first as well. But then here we are at Lock 31 in Ellenville, New York. And before I talk about that lock, there is an iron truss bridge, and that is a Squire Whipple bridge. And Squire Whipple designed these iron truss bridges for the Erie Canal. And Squire Whipple was one of the first graduates of the Union College Civil Engineering program. Kind of ties in nice, right? Look at that. And so you'll see in latter period these iron truss bridges replacing those pony truss covered bridges. But this is the kind of locks that they built largely on the D&H. I'm not sure if the Erie did a similar thing. These are composite locks. So this lock is dry laid stone. So if you go to Lock 31, well, you can't go to Lock 31. It's not gone. It's not there anymore. The road is built over it. But if you go to Lock 30, just a quarter mile north of this location, you'll see what's left of that lock, and it's just the stone now. All of this oak lining is gone. It would be white oak, and I can say definitively because I've seen the remains. It was about 2 inches thick. There's a few locks I've been doing for part of our YouTube channel, which I was going to sort of plug at the end of it. We've been producing video on the D&H Canal, and one leg of that is Where's Our Historian, where it's me out there yakking about what is there today in the ground that you can see, what the remnants are. And I encourage you, if you enjoyed this story, to go over and watch. We've got some 35 videos, and we're putting up new content every other week now. We've slowed down a little bit. We've got so much up there. So here it is. They've built this. Now, of course, this is a latter period, but this is what the locks pretty well looked like in that. They weren't this big, but this is what the locks at that point were 75 foot long, 9.5 foot wide, only 3 inches either side. These boats, also made of white oak, just cleared like a hand in glove. That way, they actually locked through in about 8 minutes in the early period, and they locked through even quicker after the final enlargement. And I'll get back to that. But the D&H also, they had a problem because their mines were in Carbondale, Pennsylvania. I love how they named places. Carbondale. What made them think of that? That's all they had there was a coal mine at that point. They had the Moosic Mountains. So Carbondale is at about 900 foot above sea level. The Moosics are about 1,800. And they could not, Jervis, in fact, postulated a water elevator. And I've got a great unpublished 1880s history by a Hollister of the D&H, where there's even a little drawing of it and stuff. But you got to think, yeah, you can have a water elevator, but unless you've got a spring on the top of your mountain, you don't have the water. These were all gravity fed. So John Jervis designs and builds, or has built really, oversees the construction of the D&H Gravity Railroad. And gravity railroads, there were 3 or 4 of them in Pennsylvania, probably more. I haven't thought to count them. And they're called gravity railroads because all the cars were connected. and they used the weight of the laden cars going down the mountain to pull up the light cars going back up. They also used water power, mule power, and eventually steam power at the tops of the planes. But the Gravity Railroad was a technological wonder of its day and typical of this company, which embraced new technologies at every turn. The D&H really is an amazing company just for corporate history. They really were the model for many big corporations. Historians in the 20th century say it was the railroads, but the D&H was there ahead of them. In fact, the D&H had a railroad first, the Gravity Railroad. The D&H also they ran the very first locomotive on tracks in the Western Hemisphere, the Starbridge Lion, albeit for one day, on August 8th of 1829. Horatio Allen, a young engineer who started working on the D&H, he quits because he knows railroads. This is 1827. And he's like, canals, nuts to that. Railroads is the thing. He quits and goes to England. The D&H then says, oh, you're over there, buy us some iron strapping. We can't get good iron strapping. And the Gravity Railroad, they hadn't invented the I-beam, the beams we think of as railroad track. They were just hemlock stringers with a half inch by 2 inch plate. And if you come visit my museum, we have a piece of it we can show you. And so the Starbridge Lion comes in, they run it for one day. Horatio Allen runs it because nobody's run one of these things. And they say it really creaked. Well, that they had a problem. The Starbridge Lion was supposed to be 5 tons. That's what Jervis said. He designed this thing to carry 5 tons. The Lion winds up 7 tons with a head of water in it. Some people have said, oh, they didn't take it, figure out the weight of the water. That's calling them too stupid. That is not the reason. My best surmise, and I got to go back and do the math because people have been questioning me, but I researched this a couple years ago. I think I like to say the Starbridge Lion was 7 tons in Starbridge, England, but it was 5 tons in Honesdale. This would be because of the imperial system. The difference in weights between the two countries, and the research I did, and it was back before I was rigorous. Now I have to go back and redo it. But it would appear that 7 tons in England in 1829 was 5 tons in America, more or less. And that to me is the best. Nobody's given me a better reason yet. But I put it out there. In fact, I'm happy to see somebody on another Facebook site cited the same thing, whether they got it from me or independently, I didn't chase down. But at any rate, a company of first, they won the first locomotive. Unfortunately, it just lie around and rusted for a while. Then they took the steam engine and reused it. But again, this is an awful lot about the D&H. So here we are. I'm about 27 minutes in. I'm running a little long there, but we'll see. The canal opens in October of 1829. Here is Ellenville, New York, again. Very similar, actually. That's the Hunt and Donaldson building right there. There's in that photograph, that same iron truss bridge that I showed you before. Here's one of the big, the post-enlargement boats. This boat would be 91 foot long, 14.5 foot wide, and eventually carries 140 tons of coal as they get more successful. So they open their canal. And as I said, the Irish really figure in, but I just love this quote. And this is John Johnston, who was a young man, became a surveyor and lawyer, and lived along the canal his entire life. In fact, the surveyors camped on his family's property in Pondetti, right along the Delaware River, near where I am right now. But John Johnston writes his memoirs when he's in his 80s, I think. And a person of that age, he doesn't pull any punches. You know how he felt about everybody. I don't like to read quotes, but I just love this one. I mean, obviously I like to do it sometimes. The mass were composed of the vulgar and debased, of ages from 10 to 60, of the various kinds, classes, and nationalities, Irish, Dutch, Africans, Americans, and others, all the most lewd, vulgar, and depraved. And honesty compels the admission that the most objectionable features were found amongst the Americans. We might not want to work on it, but there you go. By the way, Dutch, they probably are referring to the Germans, or Pennsylvania Deutsch, Dutch, not Dutchmen per se. But they also, lest you think this was the patriarchy, in 1858, in a famous court case, one of their employees actually tells you they substitute women and girls for men and boys, and often find them the best boatmen. Part of their idea of the best was that they work for less, which is why the Irish also got the job. But here's a wonderful picture. I believe this is actually from the Minisink Valley Historical Society. And this is a pair of mules. Mules were the preferred draft animal. And this young man this was typical. You would have Hoagies, young men, Hoagies, for the two phrases they said the most, ho for stop and gee for go. So they got nicknamed Hoagies, both on the Erie and the D&H. But this young man might have started as a mule driver. We have numerous stories of young Hoagies who then, by the age of 10, 11, 12, are the second hand on a boat, and full boat captains by 14 and 15, with crews younger than themselves. You grew up quick on the canal. Childhood is a 20th century invention. Children worked at a very young age, and children were important. Can you imagine being 15 years old and running a boat with two other people with 130 tons of coal on it? But that's what happened. And here's another, just a great shot of a lock. This is an E.L. Henry painting with one of those. That's not the best. That's probably, that bridge is a little fanciful. It probably was one of those more curved Squire Whipple bridges. And the canal company really wanted to take those boats up to the Hudson River and just take them right out, but they couldn't. The boats weren't really seaworthy. This is a wonderful painting of New York City, and there, what do you see there is a canal boat, either an Erie Canal boat or a D&H boat, could have been both, tied up down there. The D&H wanted all the boats to do this. The early boats couldn't do it, and even after the final enlargement, ultimately, for a variety of reasons, they couldn't. So they were forced to tow them. And well into the 20th century, I was reading a book about Burroughs, John Burroughs, and the author remarks, and he's writing in the 19 teens about seeing, both he and Burroughs mentioned they're looking out on the Hudson River and they see these, there was tows of up to 100 boats pulled behind steamboats, Thomas Cornell steamboats largely. You know, I thought of it as kind of a busman's holiday for the canalers. You might get tied up next to somebody. But in fact, what happened is the full river boats were the most expensive. Some $1,400 for a boat that could navigate the Hudson versus $1,200 for a boat that wasn't seaworthy enough, that could only navigate the canal. But they also loved section boats from the Lehigh and Delaware. The Lehigh and Delaware had a inclined plane, and it couldn't lift a big long boat. So they actually had section boats, and so half the boat would go up and down, and then the other half. A later author claimed that they could separate the load. That's hogwash. Section boats were just made for the Lehigh, but they wound up on other canals. But the reason why they were prevalent in the 1850s on the D&H was they were an $800 boat. They were the cheapest boat the canaler could buy. So the canalers loved them. The canal company did not give them enough money for the 2-day plus trip down to New York and back. They'd rather they'd rather turn around in Rondout rather than taking that extra trip down to New York City. But that led them then, because they just took everything in stride, because they couldn't take those early boats out at all. James McEntee, he starts working for the D&H. He's one of the engineers. Some people credit him with discovering cement. I don't think it was him. We don't have time to get into that now. But James McEntee, he ends up running boats for the D&H early on. He works for them as an engineer during building. Then he goes out on his own. He starts the Mansion House Hotel in Rondout. I think he owns it twice. But in 1844, they hire him to build Island Dock. And they expend, I think it was $20,000 in 1840 and 45. And basically, it was a sandbar into the Hudson, the Rondout Creek, right here, that they just cut this 40 or 50-foot wide swath through. You can see that today. And if you go on my YouTube channel, we also have a great interactive map of the route of the D&H Canal. And as my Where Is Our Historian video goes up, you can actually see me talking about that site. And I know Island Dock is up there already. But James McEntee, once again, you know, Erie Canal guy who goes on to do great things. The McEntee family becomes very well known in Kingston, as you Kingstonians who have joined me today no doubt know. Island Dock becomes very important to them since they couldn't send their boats out into the Hudson River. And it also then started you had what they called loafers. We'll see later that they also refer to them as shovelers. But and I just found this at the Century House on the left there. On the right is a bunch of loafers loading the coal piles. It looks like here what they're probably doing, they've already offloaded from the boats, and they're probably loading onto the barges that could navigate the Hudson. But on this left here is, I have no provenance on it, but it was found in the archives of the Century House Historical. We're trying to get a handle on all the stuff that Dietrich Werner had collected. But it talks about loafers, and they acquired the name because they had the broken time awaiting assignments. They acquired the occupational name of Loafers. In busy times, up to 50 to 60 gangs of loafers were employed. It was a huge and important job. And that brings me to this gentleman here, Jim Jackson, who was a shoveler or loafer in the 1890s. This is a picture in our collection, probably taken by a D&H worker and amateur photographer by the name of Louis Hoysrat. And I talk about him in my virtual museum as well. And the special thing about this is that I have got some 5,000 names of D&H workers in a database. And I've got pictures, not very many photos of oh, what are we going to do here? See if I can get rid of that. Not many. Oh, I can't do anything anymore. There we go. But this is virtually the only picture of a black D&H worker where we know his name. I could show you pictures of lots of white guys, but you know, that's just you know, it is what it is. I guess I should say. Another famous person, no Erie connection here, John Augustus Roebling. The Gravity Railroad, John Jervis had them using chain to connect all the many cars, and the cars would have 4 tons of coal in them. Well, the chains would often break because the quality of steel in early America was not what it should be. Remember, they bought the strapping from England, as I said earlier. So we went over to hemp rope, and in fact, in the 1830 annual report, they're spending $4,000 for hemp rope. Hemp rope, at least, you know, it lets you know when it's going to break, whereas the chain, you know, it was very dangerous. But hemp rope, the D&H, because the Wrtz brothers were good Quakers, and so the D&H, unlike most other canals, largely did not operate on Sundays. And the D&H Canal Company had somebody go out. The Gravity Railroad was 17 miles long. Every Saturday night, some crews would go out and take in all of the hemp rope and then put it back out Monday morning. So they needed a better way. Here, John Roebling, he's moved from what the German, it's not Germany yet really, but he's moved to Western Pennsylvania. He's going to be a sheep farmer, but that does not work out. But he had heard about, he'd studied engineering over in the mother country, and people had talked about wire rope, and people had talked, they built suspension bridges with chain that weren't too successful. John Roebling starts building wire rope on his farm in Western Pennsylvania, but then he moves to Camden, New Jersey. The Roebling Wire Rope Company, I believe, is still extant in Camden, certainly well into the 20th century. So he starts finding uses for wire rope, and Gravity Railroads were the very first people to use Roebling wire rope. And a big success, saves them from having to take it in. John Roebling actually early on supplied the rope for free until it worked out, just to get people to use it. John Roebling wound up being a very, very rich man, basically because of his wire rope business. But he also was hired by the D&H Canal to construct 4 suspension aqueducts for the D&H in their final enlargement. So in the 1830s, they're selling surface coal. They get a bad reputation. They have to fight to get people to realize, to buy their product. By the 1840s now, John Wrtz has become their president. Hone steps down after less than a year because he's been elected mayor and he sees it as a conflict of interest. John Bolton, the treasurer, steps up. Nobody liked that guy. He only lasts for a year or two. Wrtz comes in and he actually brings them, John Wrtz this is, he shepherds them through to their first success. They're so successful by the 1840s, they start making the canal deeper. That's easy. Just build up the side, stake material from the bottom, build up the towing path. And they make it a foot deeper, and that's so successful, they make it a half foot deeper. And then for a variety of reasons that I won't get too into, just to keep us on track here, they are going to do a final enlargement, and they're going to make the entire canal bigger and deeper. Eventually, the canal is anywhere from 32 to 50 foot deep, wide, and 6 foot deep. And it can then, as they made it deeper, they get up to about 80-ton burden on those 75-foot by 9.5-foot boats. But they're going to go big now because this is America, right? And so in this final enlargement, they decide that crossing the Delaware is too much of a problem. And so John Roebling builds an aqueduct over the Lackawaxen, an aqueduct over the Delaware. That one is still extant. You can visit it. It's a highway bridge today. It's the only one that's still extant. There was one over the Neversink River and one in High Falls over the Roundout Creek. Unfortunately, only the one, but at least one still survives. And so in that final enlargement now, the locks are 15-foot wide and 92-foot long. Basically, I say 40 to 50-foot wide. In spots, it was still 32-foot wide, I can tell you, because one of the things I love about the D&H history is there's so much you can tell about it today, which is why I love the Where is Our Historian? It's just an excuse for me to go out and yak at you about what's in the ground. I get so excited. So I've seen sections where it's no longer a prism. It's 32-foot wide on the top and 32-foot wide on the bottom as well. The company didn't care as long as those two boats could pass without any problems. In fact, the final enlargement, it opens in 50. It's not until 52 that they get all the squeaky spots, the spots where the boats don't quite clear. But now they can carry up to 130 tons of coal pretty regularly. You'll hear higher numbers. Here's a wonderful, I love that throwing postcards, fascinating. And it gets a bit of color because obviously all the period pictures are black and white. And here's a scene. In fact, you can see the remnant. Those of you who might know Rosendale, there's a little bit of this stone right along Route 213 that you can see. It took me forever to figure out what that was. In fact, it's pictures like this that made me realize what it was. And here they are, you know, nearly 2,000 boatmen. In fact, I can tell you up to 5,000 employees. That's just boatmen. In fact, they had up to 1,000 boats. This is in 1878, but at some period, they probably had 3,000 boatmen. And what do you know? Chiefly foreigners, once again. This is still a job Americans won't take. We have not changed much, people. Here's a beautiful, here's the gear house. This is what I'll get to that in a second. And here's a lock. This is a boat. This, I think, might be near Lawrenceville and Rosendale. I love this shot. It's so evocative. I've used this kind of as for a couple shows on the Common Worker. I just thought it was a great picture. We're very fortunate to have so many great pictures. So the D&H, you know, they're going to always try new things. Between 1853 and 1857, they convert all of their locks to a single tender. It's a semi-patented. And here is Ben Hendricks at Taylor's Lock, Sam Taylor's Lock. I think it's Lock 27 in Ellenville. Sitting on, so here's the gear house, and we have a working lock model at the Canal Museum. It'll be in our new museum opening next year. We'll still have the working lock model, and it's based on this. It's really ingenious. Part of it's patented and part of it isn't. It was patented in 1859 by a C.W. Williams in Port Jervis. So I can say pretty definitively this was for the D&H. But it doesn't really catch on because even by now, railroads are starting to overtake canals. Another wonderful E.L. Henry painting of a lock in the gear house. And that's what we call a packet boat. We carry the mail and carried passengers. Packets were common in the early canal era, but railroads could take passenger traffic. They couldn't take great weight as quickly. So we don't have a lot of pictures of packet boats. I even know historians or so-called historians who claim they didn't have them. I can say definitively the D&H ran packets. We just don't have pictures because by the photographic era, remember 1860, the railroads were getting the passenger traffic. It takes it a while before they get the coal traffic, but you know that's coming, right? But the Gravity Railroad, you can see this is 1898. This is the year the D&H Canal closes. But here's the Gravity. But what do you know? In 1872, they start having passenger traffic. And here I'll zoom in so you get a better look there. Here's all these passengers. If you go to Waymart, Pennsylvania, the Waymart Historical Society has got, I believe, one of these passenger cars, on display outside in a pavilion. They're Waymart. That's where they weighed the coal on these gravity things. But what they did, not only could it take you from Carbondale to Honesdale, but they ended up having people that would go to what they called Farview. Again, one of those wonderful names. It's the top of the Music Mountains. What do you call it? Farview, yeah. But it was a great Sunday picnic spot. In the 1880s, my friend and colleague, Dr. Powell, has got a great book on the Gravity Railroad. Actually, it's 25 DVD volumes. And there's a great story, a newspaper account. A famous natural philosopher is going to go up in a hot air balloon and parachute down at Farview. Basically, the D&H starts running amusements. And in fact, it even goes into the 20th century. Eventually, they have rail lines. By 1872, they control rail lines between New York City and all the way up to Montreal, and they go past Lake George. And to this day in Lake George Village, there is the D&H Depot. And don't you know, in 1932, the D&H was running excursion steamboats on Lake George. And you can still to this day take excursions. They're not owned by the D&H anymore. But here's this far-reaching company, a capitalistic enterprise, and they're going to make their buck anywhere they can, and they're going to embrace new technology. They're developing the American corporation. This is a really important American story, and I feel it's my job, and certainly my institution's jobs, to make more Americans aware of this. This story deserves to be better known. So the D&H had telegraph lines installed on their route, the entire route, and they used them regularly by 1849. Again, embracers. And I see as a line item in their annual reports, they're giving $12,000 a year for the right, even though they gave them the spot to run it. The problem with the telegraph line is that when they had too much coal, they could telegraph to all the lock tenders and say, don't let any coal boats through. Because there were about a couple hundred, probably maybe more, regular boats that also D&H boats, although the company sold you the boats. They owned them originally. And here's another instance of them embracing new technologies. They make the cover of the Scientific American. Remember, they didn't want to unload their coal in Roundup, but once they were stuck with it, they just went with it. And here this wonderful, I've got 2 copies of this actually. And here's a great, that's one of Louis Hoysrath's pictures on the left there. Wonderful schooner right there. And then this steel cut on the right here is that same, I believe this is the Dodge Unloader. It was the Chase elevators and the Dodge Unloaders. And here you've got both a picture of the device in use. It looks here like it must be loading it into a bigger boat, maybe. I never really parsed that. What do you know? Am I giving you any time for questions, David, or I'm just going on too long?
Well, I'm moderating a few. There was a question about the operating seasons for the canal versus the train, the length of those operating seasons and the difference between those.
The canal operated from April till maybe December, if you were lucky. Remember how I said they didn't operate on Sundays? Toward the ends of the season, they operated on Sundays. You did not want your boat to get iced in because then you're stuck on it, or you lose your load of coal, and you're responsible for that. At $10 a ton, at least, do the math, right? Yeah, so it was April through December typically. Was navigation. It actually made the New York Times when the date of opening. It was front page of the Times early on. The D&H Canal is going to open on this day. Yeah, so you figure you needed the coal in the winter when you couldn't transport it. And so, again, it was kind of destined. It's interesting because as I investigate the lives of canalers, there's one enterprising Irishman who starts out on the Morris Canal, but he says the D&H pays better. He does one trip on the Morris and then goes to the D&H. My surmise is that because the D&H paid better, he started out the Morris because it could open earlier because it was further south. But then as soon as he could get on the D&H, he did. The Erie probably had a similar season, I'm going to imagine. Actually, being a little farther north, the Erie season could have even been a little shorter, couldn't it have? But the D&H, though the D&H company was a coal company, when they stopped running a canal, they're still a coal railroad. But they encouraged other industries and, in fact, developed some. A case in point, Rosendale Cement. So those of you who know your Erie history know that a gentleman by the name of Canvas White was also an engineer, originally on the Erie. He went to England and studied engineering. He comes back, he learns about natural cement over there. Well, the Egyptians knew about, or the Romans, the Romans knew about natural cement, but then it was lost. Natural cement is a dolomitic limestone that when you heat it, you calcine it, it changes chemically, and it becomes more friable, so you can grind it. You grind that into a fine powder, and it makes the hardest cement known to man, hydraulic cement. It dries underwater. You know, if you're going to build a canal, hydraulic cement's the stuff. So Canvas White, he discovers near Chenango this dolomitic limestone. He figures out the process again, sort of re-engineers it. He gets a patent on it, and then everybody violates his patent. But the state of New York gives him $10,000. And in fact, later on in our story, well, let me tell the story in order. The D&H now is digging their canal, and don't you know, they have a geologist along with their crews, and I think that it was because of Canvas White. But suffice it to say, in their first annual report, there's a lot of different stories about people credit James McEntee. We have stuff where James McEntee reminisces, and he never mentions cement, nor was he a geologist. The earliest mention I have of the discovery of Rosendale Cement in a primary source is the very first annual report for the D&H, where they say it was a geologist hired by the company. And why did they do that? Because of the Erie, is my surmise. Again, as a historian, we have to sometimes have to, kind of figure stuff out. I just think it's important to say, now, this is my supposition, people. If I can prove it, I will. I'll keep working on this one. So the D&H, they discovered the cement. They were going to import it from the Erie Canal, but now they don't have to. And it's funny because they mine some of this cement. They get enough for their works, and then it closes down when the canal is built. 1828, it's opened. But then by 1830, Watson Lawrence invents the continuous draw kiln, Lawrenceville Cement. He owns 3 different cement companies. It becomes dubbed Rosendale Cement. And it's an industry that has got to owe some of its success to the fact that affordable transportation provided by the D&H Canal. There's in fact one historian whose book claims the D&H Canal existed because of the cement. I haven't been able to read his books, but I digress. But this is an important industry that this canal fostered, and in fact, the D&H Canal runs Rosendale Cement until 1916 at least, and possibly 1917. All the secondary sources will tell you earlier, but I can say definitively from primary source documents. But more than half of North America's cement in the second half of the 19th century is this so-called Rosendale cement. This is D&H moved cement. This is why the D&H was prosperity. I love coopering. I'm a woodworker. Coopering is fascinating. Coopering refers to making a round wooden box. Coopering's been around since Egyptian times. I knew I'd get that in there. This is Lawrenceville, Watson Lawrence's. This is kind of interesting. I'm going to digress for a second. There's the Pony Truss Bridge there, and there's a Squire Whipple iron truss bridge right behind it. This one didn't need replacement. This one was put in once, when that technology was more accepted. But coopers were really important overall in early American history. No ship of discovery went without coopers on board. If you were going to go get whale oil, he would build the barrels. So they were barrel makers, and it was a huge industry. Canvas White and his brother Hugh, they moved to Rosendale in 1830, and they opened up Whiteport. And Whiteport doesn't move its product in the D&H. It moves it on a railroad, a mule-pulled railroad. But Whiteport becomes, by 1850, when I think it's, I forget who buys them out, one of the big cement companies, they're making 1,000 barrels of cement, 800 barrels a day. So a huge industry. Coopers working all along. I mean, coopers were also important. They made your sap buckets, your wash tubs. They made your firkins and your butter tubs, and just about anything that you were, a round wooden box. It was your cooper. Fascinating. And early barrels had red birch hoops. Metal hoops don't come about until the 1890s or the 1900s. And that was a huge winter industry for farmers and canalers, was to make barrel hoops during the winter time. We're doing pretty good here. Checking my time. Coming along.
We do have a question coming in from Chris about how did the D&H Canal Company transition into the D&H Railroad?
Oh, now you're getting ahead of my story. Well, so they just start, they see the writing on the wall. They've got a gravity railroad. They wind up with 2 because of the PA Coal Company. The PA Coal Company builds, and the PA Coal Company starts as a friendly rival, but virtually all of their officers are D&H people. It's one of the reasons why they did the final enlargement. And in the end, the company turns on them, never pays what they're supposed to towards the enlargement, and it starts this great court case. And it's a wonderful primary source that I'm reading. It's some 5,000 pages. I'm about 3/4 through my first read through. Fascinating stories. But now I really digress. The D&H starts buying up and building railroads by 1872. They control railroads from New York City to Montreal. They're smart. They're going to get their coal up to Canada where they need it, and they're investing in railroads at that time. They continue running the canal as long as it's financially feasible, and when it isn't, they abandon the canal. What cost actually $2 million to build and more than that to enlarge, they sell to Samuel Kirkendall, Thomas Cornell's son-in-law and heir, for $10,000. He starts buying up cement companies, and he continues running the D&H Canal. He dies in 1914, but the cement companies that he was buying up continue using the canal for that cement until at least 1916, possibly 1917. But another industry that was extractive industry in the area that was able to take advantage of the affordable transportation that the D&H Canal afforded was bluestone. Bluestone is a sandstone that also comes in red and green varieties, but the blue is the most prized. It's only found in northeastern Pennsylvania up into Vermont, but it was a prized flagging material. This is actually Wilkes Barre, Pennsylvania, a quarry. I know that the quarries here in Pond Eddy, New York, there's one at the Minisink Battleground, is also a bluestone quarry. The only reason they could exploit that was because they had the canal down the hill, right? That's right up the hill from the Roebling Aqueduct. We like to go hiking there over in this part of the country. So bluestone, it's not slippery when wet, and so it made wonderful sidewalk sidings. In fact, in the town of Beacon, I walk on sidewalks that still have bluestone moved out on the D&H Canal in the 19th century. Huge industry. Here is the Ulster County Directory from 1872, I think it is. Beers. This building is still extant in Wilbur, New York, along the roundabout. Oops, we've gotten ahead of ourselves again. And this is a Portland cement from the 1860s, one of the early Portland cements. There's an ice house, by the way, another early industry that employed your farmers and canalers in the winter months. But here's a whole bunch of bluestone not far from this building, and you see it here too, being loaded. Here's the derrick to get it onto the boats, onto the sloop. Huge industry, and it could not have found a market without the D&H Canal. We had wonderful Shogun conglomerates. The locks near in High Falls, they rerouted the canal in the final enlargement. My National Historic Landmark 5 Locks Walk is made of this local Shogun conglomerate, but it also made wonderful millstones. The Sopas stones or Sopas millstones were said to rival the French stones. And these are stone cutters in St. Joseph and Alligerville. I drive past there these days on Towpath Road. You know, folks, whenever you see a road called Canal Road, Berm Road, because the berm in that era was the side of the canal opposite the towpath. The towpath was what we would call a berm today, but in the 19th century, it's my contention that that's how the name berm got crossed over to the other side, basically. But in the 19th century, the berm was just the other side of the canal. But this Shogun conglomerate was used in all the locks, the cut stone locks that we have in High Falls. But it also made these wonderful millstones that, as they say, competed with the French. And I drive through that area on Towpath Road now, and you can see just tons of tailings and front yards and stuff, all overgrown. But the remains of that industry are still very much right along that road. There's a blank that never got finished, a small grinding stone blank. I keep saying, oh, somebody should do something with that. Don't just go taking that. It might belong to somebody, people. Boat building. The boats only lasted 5 to 10 years. Can you imagine? And there was up to 1,000 boats plying their trade. It was a huge industry because of all the canals. The Erie must have had even more boatyards. I am accumulating the names of boat builders now, and boy, there's just I haven't counted them yet. I've got to put them together in a Excel file. Huge industry, very busy. You'll see all along the route of the canal. There'll be a dry dock. And then, what do you know? Right there is a sawmill, or was, and they build them right there. And here's a dry dock in Ellenville, New York. I believe this is the Hoar, H-O-A-R dry dock. I don't think this is the one that's there's one that's at the Bova Road facility that Sullivan County runs. There's a great D&H park there. The wonderful thing about the D&H is you can hike many stretches of it. Orange and Sullivan County own the entire canal bed. And I'll tell you my website. There's a link to a map that points out all these points of interest. And if you're interested in hiking the canal, it can show you where you can legally, not trespassing, walk along the canal. And there's video and pictures that show you what's there. Canals were great for moving glass. To this day in England, I'm told that ceramicists move their product on canals because they have less breakage, less trouble. The Ellenville Glass Factory, they shipped sand up from New Jersey, up the Hudson River, up the Atlantic Ocean, up the Hudson River, and built glass in Ellenville. They had their own slip. Nothing much left of it today, unfortunately. Leather. There was rawhides down in South America and the Caribbean. Presumably, they didn't have the kinds of trees that produced tannic acid, like hemlock and oak. So they would ship rawhides up the Atlantic Ocean, up the Hudson River. Some didn't go out the canal, but many went out on the canal In fact, they say the Union Army marched on Ellenville leather. And there we've got pictures of rawhides on the left there and processed leather on the right. I always like to have an interesting picture. I just discovered this. Whenever I see a picture of the D&H I've never seen, Dietrich Werner, the founder of the Century House Historical, I'm proud to be on their board. This I just found in a box going through the archives. I scanned it immediately. What a wonderful picture! It's the latter era. Look at how this gentleman is dressed. That's almost 20th century. I'm thinking it's the 1890s because you can't really see it, but it says D&H Canal Company here. It's a numbered boat. While you were buying the boat from the canal company, it had a number. When you paid it off, you gave it a name. But here's the crazy thing. I don't know if you can see right there in the reflection. That is a cutout of a bobby. I have no idea why it's there, but I think it's kind of fun. There's a story there. I'm going to have to chase it down. Why would you have a cutout of a bobby, of all things, of a London policeman on your canal boat? I think, too, I'll be able to figure out this might be Phillipsport. This building ought to be able to. I just found this 2 weeks ago and decided to throw it in here because I just loved it. So, as you said, how did it turn into a railroad? Well, there were speculation. At one point, they were going to actually drain and build a railroad along it in the 1870s. It shows up in the papers and the primary sources. Nothing came of it in the end. But here it is in 1895. The boating is very poor on the canal. Many little girls are seen driving the teams. Why? Because they're cheaper. Wonderful painting on the towpath, E.L. Henry. Young girl, it looks like she's doing some sort of either needlework or something. We have a great story in Dorothy Sanderson's book of a woman who did her schoolwork while riding the mules. For the most part, they walked alongside them, probably didn't want to tire them. But, now the canal is people are speculating it's going to go. They were a smart company. While it made money, they kept running it. And when it didn't, they decided to get rid of it. And here we go, a postcard of the old canal near Ellenville. Obviously, no water. There's a boat with Lord knows whether it was carrying lumber or if that's just what happened. They made the darndest postcards, didn't they? I'm fascinated by postcards. I buy way too many of them. But it's a great way to get images that you wouldn't see otherwise. And just one final postcard image, just near where I am today here at the Stick It Inn. I want to give my hosts a plug. That was really nice of them to give me this room so as to not have internet problems. I'm going to have to figure out where this is. I think this house could still be extant. I've got to go over there and see. And here's one of the locks. But this is a postcard I got recently of obviously the abandoned canal. There it is. No water in that now. But the D&H lived on. The D&H became a railroad. And here is the D&H. You can tell by the way these gentlemen are dressed. This is the early 20th century. They just, took canal out of their name and kept on going. They continue being a coal company until the middle of the 20th century when they they took on other freight, as I've pointed out in this talk. Whenever they saw an opportunity to make money, they made money. They started amusement parks. I personally claim that it was the gravity railroads like the D&H that started the amusement park industry because of places like Farview. And I got tickled when I discovered that they actually ran steamboats in the 20th century. But that's the D&H for you. But all things must end in the D&H Canal. No longer the D&H Railroad went bankrupt in 1990 and now is a wholly owned subsidiary of Canadian Pacific. Recently, the DHTHC got these wonderful period maps, 1854 survey of the entire route of the D&H Canal. The National Historic Landmark registration for the D&H Canal is going to be redone. They've gotten the money, and these maps are going to be a big help. I've actually been hired by one of the contractors. I would have been doing the work anyways, but I'm proud to say I'll be working alongside them. But these maps are a great resource, and if you visit my website, and there's a failing. Why is my web address not on this slide? Canalmuseum.org. That will direct you to our YouTube channel and to this wonderful interactive Google map. My YouTube channel has lots of great content, including this talk eventually. I've got video that's 3 and 4 minutes long, and we've got over an hour long. We'd love to have you go join us. I also please support my friends at Schoharie Crossing. I'm going to get up there when things loosen up a little bit. But I really enjoyed speaking with you folks, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Awesome. That was great. Thank you so much, Bill. We do have a few questions, and I'm going to kind of go through and I guess ask a couple of the newer questions first, and then we'll work our way back a little bit. But there's a question from Hal about how the boats were repurposed or how they were otherwise, what happened to them essentially after their 5 to 10 year lifespan.
That's a good question. Some of them just sank, so I can show you in Slatesburg on my Facebook page. It's 3 or 4 years old now. Somebody submitted a picture. Yes, Chester, abandoned. In fact, we know in the middle of the 20th century, in the 1950s, there were a whole bunch of these boats being stored in the Roundout Creek. And they piled up in Eddyville and Slatesburg. They finally had the Army Corps of Engineer come in and burn them all because nobody was doing anything with them. So basically, as I said, canal boats operated the Erie. Those boats probably had lives until the 1920s because I can say, there was Burroughs and the author say, oh, look, a tow of canal boats out there. But eventually, it'd be great to have one, but, 90 foot long, 14 and a half foot, that's a big boat, isn't it? But
absolutely. And there are a few things I've come across where boats are either repurposed, broken down, they're burnt. Some of them were scuttled in various places along the Erie. So another question here coming in from Lori was asking if engineers from Stevens University had anything to do with this. Seems like they should have. And also, were Italian immigrants involved at all?
The period of Italian immigration is later. And it's funny because I just found an interpretive panel because I'm moving my museum that erroneously said Italians built the D&H Canal. They didn't. That's because they don't start coming over to America until the 1880s, 1890s, early 20th century. Italian immigration, and I'm not an expert on the history of immigration, but we would have hired them if they were here, but they weren't here enough. It was the Irish, I tell you. Irish and Germans, but largely Irish. I got a small grant from the community foundations of the Hudson Valley to direct my research last year to the marginalized population. And the pilot log at the Hudson Valley Maritime Museum has an article of mine on immigrants in the D&H. The Erie Canal Museum published it before I spoke on their site back in March or April, I forget. But that talk is also up on my channel. Yeah, lost my train of thought there. It happens every once in a while.
All right. So we do have a few other questions. I just real quick before I ask those, I did make a note, and I was going to make a connection to Roebling for you to Schoharie Crossing, and these are kind of thin connections, but they are not quite as thin as his wire rope. But you have Roebling. So far as in terms of Schoharie Crossing, the connections would be the first one that comes to mind is that Colonel John Littlejohn, who built the first dam across the Schoharie for the Erie Canal, his son became Reverend Abraham Newkirk Littlejohn, who gave the opening blessing to the wonderful bridge down there in Brooklyn, which is a Roebling design.
Roebling design, but not built by him.
Right. And a very similar thing is the Tribes Hill to Fort Hunter suspension bridge, which used Roebling wire and partially his design that spanned across the Mohawk River, connecting the hamlet of Fort Hunter and Tribes Hill right next to the canal site here. And that was from 1853 to 1935. So we at least here at Schoharie Crossing have some connection to Roebling in those ways. And I will stretch at any connection I can when it comes to history. So there's a few comments here about bargewood furniture down near New Orleans being pretty popular from discarded barges, at least from the barges on the Mississippi. There's Amy is asking if you could speak to any canal boats that might have been made of concrete. That may be something that those of the Erie and the early 20th century Erie Canal would be aware of. So if there's any connection there. Particularly if they use Rosendale cement to make those, that would be great.
Right? Well, that's interesting because by the turn of the 20th century, Portland supplants Rosendale cement. And the story is because it dried quicker and contractors liked it. And this is true. But I also read somewhere, and I just have to believe it, that the Portland cement manufacturers got the ASME, the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, to rewrite the specs such that it favored Portland cement. But don't you know, A.J. Snyder, who the A.J. Snyder had a flour mill when the canal came through. He had a slip there. Rosendale cement's discovered. Some people say it was on the Snyder estate. I'm going to try and the Snyder estate, which is now the Century House Historical. There were 3 or 4 generations of Snyders, and the last A.J. Snyder lives until 1974. He discovers that if you take, I think it's 4 bags of Portland to 1 bag of hydraulic cement, that it makes a much stronger product. And there's actually parts of Route 32 just north of Rosendale, and I have to go find them if they haven't been paved over, where they did test pours of it. But he convinces the Thruway Authority, and the New York State Thruway is the last major project. You know, Rosendale cement was used in the Capitol, it was used in the Croton Aqueduct and Dam, it was used Statue of Liberty base. You know, it was used a lot of different places, but the final major project was the New York State Thruway. That's right, Chester. Also the caissons for building the Brooklyn Bridge, certainly. And somebody said Towpath Road. Actually, it does, but just not that closely. Actually, it's Berm Road, and you don't. Well, it's funny. You can't see the canal, and then the canal is way down the hill from it. So there are sections where it's not as close as you'd like it to be, but it is the closest road, and it was built on the towpath side, and that's where they get the names. But yes, you're right. It's not necessarily directly next to it, but I always like to say when you see the name, start looking around, because there is a canal somewhere there.
There's a connection, absolutely. And I think I'm going to ask this so we'll wrap up with this last question from Amy, because I think this is a really great question, and particularly to ask you. What is something that you learned or discovered about the canal that really surprises you as a historian?
I learned and discovered. But, you know, I've got to say, well, you know, and I guess that didn't really. That's a tough question. You know, I mean, I've learned so many things about it, and I find it all fascinating. I mean, well, you know, one of the things that I'm still working on, I cannot find any account of a black man digging the canal. And I'm surprised, because I think it had to have happened. But then again, they're marginalized. You didn't write about black people. And I found a great newspaper article that says the very first boatload of coal unloaded, of D&H coal unloaded at Roundout, was unloaded by 3 loafers, all named John. And one was Irish, one was German, and one was black. So I know black workers were there from the start, but I can't find anything that says there were blacks digging it. And I think it's because they're marginalized. It also could be because of prejudice. You're largely Irish, weren't going to work alongside blacks. We also see that the Canal Society in New York back in 2012 visited my site, and I interacted with them, was speaking to them. We were talking about trying to find pictures of people of color in our archives. I do a presentation on the marginalized populations, and I'm working on this larger article that'll be hopefully in the Hudson River Valley Review next spring. And sorry, I'm losing it now, folks. It's hot in this room here. Joe Jackson, Chester. Yes, the only black name we know. Yeah, sorry about that. I just went completely blank. Don't get old, folks. But there was, you know, what it is too, is I'm seeing some of the chats come up, and it is sort of, it is so wet. It's all the way from the beginning there. I'll let you.
And I think that was there's a lot of really good commentary about you know, whether they were somebody apparently knows how cold Waxahachie is in March. New York does have some history. There's a link that was put up to a Queens College project. See, Tom says that the library science students at Queens College built a database of waterways in New York, which contains D&H postcards. There's a link there for those of you that want to operate that on the chat. But it is dcmny.org. You can look through that for the content, Queens College waterways. And also, I know there's Digital Heritage New York has some really great postcard collections as well. If anybody's looking for postcards of New York, they have a very impressive collection on their website, which I don't have the address handy in my mind to put out there. But I found this quite fascinating, and you can definitely see that there are connections that you don't really have to stretch very far to make when it comes to the D&H Canal, the Erie Canal, and the other, as you put, the Canal Fever and the Canal Mania that was sweeping not just New York, but the country at the time. So I really do appreciate your time this evening, Bill. I appreciate everybody tuning in for this program. And definitely, if you've enjoyed it, send a message over to Bill's D&H Canal. I'm sure that they have stuff up on their website about if you want to further promote their events, programs, or possibly provide a donation to the D&H Canal. The Friends of Schoharie Crossing are a nonprofit entity as well. You can get a hold of me if you're interested in supplying a donation to them. But mostly, if you can make it to the D&H Canal, definitely check out all that you can. They have, like Bill mentioned, places you can walk and explore. Come to Schoharie Crossing, check it out. Bill's given another shout out to his host and Wi-Fi usage this evening. Stick it in. So thank you so much. I appreciate everybody for tuning in. This has been a very educational and extremely fun. So thank you so much, Bill.
Well, thank you for having me, David. This was a hoot, and thank you everybody that came. It was really enjoyable. I hope both our sites support us if you can. They're tough times for all of us, but this is a fascinating story and one that's living today. So it's one that you can explore on your own. Get out and get some exercise while you're at it. And absolutely. I should also thank Deborah Conway one more time for getting my hosts Roswell and Johnny to get me this room. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful evening.